Welcome to the Future of Field Service podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Today, we are going to answer the question, is your view of outcomes-based service limiting your success? We talk a lot about outcomes-based service and delivering greater experiences and guaranteed results to our customers. But today, we're going to dive in a little bit more to what that really means and how you may be keeping your view too small of the opportunities for you with your customer base. I am excited to welcome to the podcast today, Chris Fratta, Vice President and Head of Professional Services and Solutions Delivery at Philips. Chris, welcome to the Future of Field Service podcast.
Hey, Sarah, thanks for having me. It's so nice to virtually be with you here today. It's like everybody's reality all day, every day.
I wish we were doing these on site in a studio. Maybe we'll get there someday, but for now, virtual, yes, and happy to have you. So, Chris, before we dig into the topic at hand, tell our listeners a bit about yourself, your background, and your role at Philips.
Thanks, Sarah. First, let me tell you a little bit about Philips, and I'll dive into my role. Philips has been around for about 130 years. We're 80,000 employees worldwide, and our purpose is to improve the lives and well-being of people through innovation and technology. We're very specifically focused on healthcare. And that's actually been a transformation from Philips. People who are familiar with the brand would know we've sold consumer electronics like flat TVs and lighting and things like that. But we've divested the portfolio and we're 100% focused on healthcare. So it's been a big shift for Philips. And also part of our strategy and another big shift, and what I want to talk to you about today, is that we're shifting from a company that primarily sold products to a company that sells solutions. And just to use a simple definition of a solution, for me, that means hardware, software, services, kind of bundled together, both Philips developed content as well as third parties. And that together, these things solve a customer's problem and deliver an outcome better than a product would on a standalone basis. So that's kind of in a nutshell who Philips is. I've had a long career in healthcare. I've worked at HP, Hewlett-Packard, back when they had a medical device product group. I've worked at a company called Electa, which is an oncology-focused medical technology company. But I've spent most of my career at Philips and most of my career in services. I've run call centers and technical support groups. I've run field service teams, both on the software and IT side as well as on the capital equipment side. And these days, my job is really, as you said in the title, it's around solutions delivery. So as we make the shift into solutions, how do I sort of repurpose an organization that was designed to deliver break fix into a solution that an organization that sort of consults up front with our customers around how to design a solution and takes them through an implementation. And then, at the end, it's really all about helping customers adopt the technology so they can achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve. Mm-hmm. So a lot of words there, but that's sort of what my job is. It's to run these teams. I have team members who are solution architects. I have team members that are project and program managers, technical consultants, which I've converted, and maybe we can talk about this. I've converted a lot of field service engineers or technicians into a role called technical consultant. Mm-hmm. And for us, because we're in healthcare, clinical application specialists who do training and consultation on the products and solutions.
Okay, excellent. So there's a lot we're going to dive into, and I'm very excited to do so. I said in the intro, and you kind of mentioned in your introduction of yourself, the conversations I have with people across a variety of industries these days are in some way all tied back to this concept of solving customer problems instead of delivering a product, a service, right? So this idea of, however you want to say it, for a product organization moving this way, often servitization, delivering more outcomes, that sort of thing, So you already defined that for us. And I think it was a very simple but very good definition, which is putting together solutions that solve customer problems, right? So that makes perfect sense. Let me ask you, why do you feel this is the path every company in some form or another is on right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about it. Maybe what's going on in the IT space where everything is as a service today, or maybe, companies like Uber, they've kind of set the world on fire with their business model. So if you think about Uber, the car company's model was to build and sell you a car, and they make all their money then they service it after and keep it running. But you, as a consumer, do you really want a car? Or do you just want to get from A to B?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of what it's all about. So I think that we have a demographic shift going on in society where people are growing up kind of around these business models. But I also, if I think about my business space in healthcare specifically, like hospitals are stretched. They don't have the capital they used to have. A lot of them don't make a huge operating margin. So these innovative business models where you're sort of tied in as a supplier to the customer's outcome and success. I mean, it just works well because of the economic model they're in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've seen it happen in other industries. Like I think IT was the first place it really happened. I think IBM started this revolution, whether they wanted to or meant to or
Mm-hmm.
not, when they kind of got out of the mainframe business and got into like web services.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in the headline, we said, are you limiting your view? Okay, so as an organization, whatever industry you're in, if you're thinking about how do we act more as a trusted advisor, how do we sell solutions instead of products? Um, Oftentimes, the first thing people think of is, well, we need to guarantee uptime. That must be the answer,
Yeah.
uptime, right? And our argument today is that there's nothing wrong with guaranteeing uptime, but if that is where you sort of stop, right, and whether in your thought process or in action, you achieve this, and then you just end there, you could really be limiting your potential to expand your service revenue because if you can step outside of maybe your historical role in your customer's landscape and think more about how you could potentially solve some of the problems they have, you may find different opportunities to contribute to the outcomes that they need to drive. So, tell us a little bit about some of the different ways that Philips has expanded its portfolio to deliver more customer outcomes.
Yeah. And it's funny you start off with the uptime comment because, as I told you, I've had a long career in service. And I think that traditionally it was about keep my system up. And so it was about making it available. And I think over the past 10 years, at least in healthcare technology, it kind of shifted from, I want it to be available, but I also want it to integrate with the rest of everything else that's going on. So in healthcare, it meant sending data from devices to an EMR. So it's about integration. But now I think it's really about help me adopt it so that I can be successful. So in healthcare, hospitals talk about a quadruple aim. Their targets as healthcare providers is to achieve this quadruple aim, and it's financial outcomes, clinical outcomes, patient satisfaction, and staff satisfaction. So I'll give you a couple of examples of where Philips plays in this space and where we've been successful. So in an intensive care unit, you have a system of patient monitors. And they connect to a network, and nurses are able to centrally monitor like the vital signs of a patient, and they respond when an alarm goes off. So we've always sold that as a capital equipment with some services bolted in. And there's uptime and bench repair and all these things that go on to make the monitors available. So that's the way we've always done it. Last year, or actually a couple of years ago now, we had a first of kind implementation in a big hospital in Florida. We actually offered this as a service. So instead of getting paid for the monitors after we've implemented them and sold them and then going on a service contract, we actually get paid per patient day. And so, so what is the customer trying to do there? Let me talk about the outcomes that we're looking for. We're trying to make sure that they're efficient. We don't want patients to stay in an ICU any longer than they need to stay in an ICU. We're trying to make sure that as they move around the hospital, from the OR back into a post-op recovery area and what have you, that we don't lose any data. It's really important that the data gets captured through the whole journey. And then, of course, we don't want them to be readmitted and things like that. And so through this offer, we're able to completely upgrade a hospital where they wouldn't normally have the capital to do it all. Every unit of the hospital is using the same technology, so a nurse can move from one place to another. They get software upgrades through the life cycle of these things because they're Philips's assets at the end, not the customers.
Mm-hmm.
So we're them up to the latest and greatest revs and things like that. And what we're seeing, and last year was a great example because COVID happened. And when COVID happened, all of a sudden there was a different subset of patients that needed really specific care. So we're able to adapt and get monitors where they need to go in the hospital without the customer spending an extra penny, right? So that's one example of where we've done it. We've done some great studies at this customer whereby we asked the staff, "Hey, how do you like the new technology?" And I mean, it was just off the charts positive. This hospital was literally at a place where they'd have to new patient would get admitted and they have to check to see if they could find a monitor that worked.
Mm-hmm.
If it was from brand X or brand Y, they wouldn't necessarily know how to interact with that monitor. So the patient or the staff satisfaction went up really high.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the financial outcome was a big improvement for them. Instead of spending this huge amount of capital up front, they moved their spend from capex to opex.
Mm-hmm.
So if they have a lot of customers, their bill goes up for the month, sort of like our gas or our electric bill, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if they don't have a lot of customers, when they have a down month, their fees go down accordingly. And then we saw some clinical outcomes too. So it's specifically, because they had this hodgepodge of technology, it took a long time for them to transfer a patient from one unit to the other, which meant patients sitting around kind of in limbo.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that we have all the Philips equipment in house, they're able to transport patients quicker. The nurses are happy with that, and the patients spend less time, kind of just waiting for something to happen. So that's one example. Another example that I would cite is that we have something called managed technology services. It's an offer that Philips has, where we actually would go in with the hospital staff, assess their install base of technology, and help them make a 10-year plan for replacement. So Philips will finance that equipment. We will service it for them, regardless if it's ours or a third party. But the key is that we really help them to adopt and utilize the equipment well. So we have like counters on all of our equipment. We can zoom in and see if an MRI is being 65% utilized in one unit, and you have another unit that might be 120% utilized, maybe they run on a second or a third shift or what have you. We can take that information back to the customer and say, hey, look, you could utilize this one asset better. Or maybe it's time to retire it because the service costs are too high. So really partnering with their capital asset planning, because let's face it, what our customers, and in my case, what healthcare customers are really good at is providing care to a patient, not
Mm-hmm.
capital planning for medical equipment. But at Philips, that's what we do all day long. And so we're able to kind of help and assist. And that's an example of helping a customer, drive a financial outcome. And we've had some really good success stories with that. It's not an easy model to shift into, and it takes a little bit of courage, and it's kind of risky because these
Mm-hmm.
couple of times that you move in, the model's not always perfect, but you go out and you get your feet wet and you start to learn from it, and then you hone the model. So I think the real key though, Sarah, is if you have shared goals with your customer, now they're partners and not customers. And
Right.
you win, they win, and vice versa. So, in the first example I gave, if we could increase the number of patient days that the customer is being monitored, because we're consulting with the customer and helping them put these devices in the right places, then I get a higher patient per day price, but they also get better utilization of the asset. So
Right.
uptime is like keeping the thing available. But we're talking about is making sure it's used and used well and used to deliver these quadruple aim outcomes. And that's probably a good way to state it and kind of summarize the point.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think, it is interesting, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, Chris. There's a great overlap there for companies that are willing to find it of needs customers have, real needs, real value opportunities, not forced, not, hey, we need to increase our service revenue. So what can we try and sell them? But real opportunities to help that
Mm-hmm.
can help your business build revenue. I mean, it really can be a mutually beneficial place that you can get to. And this is a good example of that. Before we talk about some of the complexities, I did want to just go back to the examples you shared. So obviously, there is a real thing of, for a lot of these hospitals and health systems, modernizing the equipment they have and the lift that can bring in patient care itself, right? But to your point, there's a lot of planning that goes into that. There's a lot of, knowledge about what's needed and where it's needed and what the right patient flow is and things like that, on top of this change in model that we're going to talk a little bit more about to being OpEx versus CapEx. But the other thing, and we're also going to talk more about this, but I want to clarify it before we dive in, is some of the opportunity from a services perspective to kind of expand the skills that you're leveraging to bring value to your customers. And I know from one of our earlier conversations, there's a couple we talked about that I'm hoping you can touch on. One is knowing that this equipment is part of a hospital's bigger IT infrastructure, there's some opportunity there. And then I think a really big one, because I think it, covers a lot of different industries and a lot of needs people's customers have, is this idea of, hey, we see you're only using your MRI machine at 65% capacity. To your point, maybe they have an extra one they don't need or something like that, but it could be, maybe their staff is struggling because they're not good at using it, or they need some extra training. And so I believe you've also kind of expanded into some more services there to help assist your customers in making sure that their staff is effective as well. So can you speak to those two aspects?
Well, yeah, I'll take the first piece about how, things have really shifted. When I first started my career, when we hired a field service engineer, we were looking for somebody who had a mechanical engineering or electric engineering background. And then we taught them customer skills.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, most devices were standalone. They didn't talk to themselves or each other. They didn't connect to the hospital's network and things like that. And if they ran software, it was proprietary for the most part. Now, everything is on common platforms, Microsoft and things like that. Everything is highly integrated and talking to each other. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I was really involved in sort of our patient monitoring solutions, and they're really highly networked. So we start to realize that we need to get network experts on the team. And so we kind of went down this path of, we think our guys are really smart, our guys and girls, and they can get Cisco trained and certified. So we provided them that opportunity to make the shift. At the same time, we were growing. So as we were hiring new people, we brought in Cisco trained and certified people that were really good with networks. And then there were people who were in the ranks that realized, the way things are going, maybe this isn't the job for me anymore. So we kind of went through a 5-year journey where some of our internal folks stepped up and learned the skills as we were hiring. We hired people with those skills. We hired a lot of people actually from the military who have been network trained, but also people from data centers and banks and things like that. We had to teach them what healthcare was. And then we had some turnover. There's kind of a demographic thing going on, in terms of baby boomers retiring and things like that. So about a third, it was about a third, if you know what I mean. So that was a big shift we had to make, and now we're seeing it again where networking is kind of not enough. We're seeing a few specialties that we have to get really good at. So cybersecurity is one. We're starting to hire in staff that has some experience and background around cybersecurity. Microsoft OSs, Microsoft Server and things like that. Virtualization is really a big thing, so VMware. So all of those skills have been important for us to realize we needed them and then either acquire them or train people to get them. So that's kind of a little bit about the first question. I think the second question, I'll give you a really good example of sort of the Philips as trusted advisor and consultative partners. If you're in an ICU, there's all these alarms going off all the time. It's really, really a stressful place to be. If you're visiting a loved one, it's stressful. If you're sick in the hospital, it's really stressful too. It's particularly stressful for nurses. They're hearing these beeps, and the beep turns into a page on their phone. There's a central monitor. There's things going on all the time, and it turns out that a lot of them are false positives or alarms that don't need to be responded to. So what we are able to do is to go in and consult with the nursing staff, make decisions around their alarm policies. They can lower thresholds, they can silence certain alarms and things like that. It's a really collaborative process. I mean, as Philips, we can't go in and tell them what their alarm policy should be. They need to make those decisions on their own with information from us. So we can say, for example, at hospital, X, we see a best practice whereby they set this alarm here. And then they make those decisions and we can implement them on the monitors. And so, we've had to take our clinical educators who were nurses for the most part. Well, almost every clinical educator in Philips has credibility and background as a nurse, but we had to teach them how to facilitate that discussion. So they went away and learned how to run a Kaizen so that I can get a group of nurses from the hospital site to get in and be open and have this conversation. And we just have great results from that as an offer. And it's great because it's done in conjunction, and you see the hospital nurses, sometimes they start the conversation like this and they just don't want to hear it or know it. And it's like something outside of their day-to-day job that they don't have time for. And 6 weeks later, they talk about it being like a life-changing experience, having participated in something like that. And now there are fewer inoperable or false alarms. There's just there's less noise, and they can focus on what's really important. So that's a good example. It took time, to build that skill on the team. Nurses tend to be really good at it for whatever reason. I think they have the levels of empathy, but it's a good example of where we do that. We do some cybersecurity consulting, helping hospital CIOs prepare a plan and a strategy for things that live outside the data center. So we're in a world where everything is a connected device, and IT people tend to be really good at connected devices that are computers. But when it's an MRI machine or a patient monitor or an ultrasound, they don't typically know how to apply an OS patch to a device like that. You can't just say, hey, there's going to be a maintenance window in the ICU at 3 o'clock on Sunday. It doesn't work like that. So it's a different problem set. So we advise and we help with things like that. I mentioned some of the capital planning and, of course, utilization of the devices. So yeah, it's a special skill set. We've taught some of the staff how to do it, like the clinical educators. In other areas, we've brought in consultants to do that work.
Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to touch on based on what you just said. The first is, going back to the title of our podcast and not limiting your view of outcomes, right? So what you just described to me is a perfect example of, you start with your core competency, and maybe you even servitize that well, right? So instead of just offering products, now you've bundled that with services. So you are Philips and you offer X equipment and you can service it supremely, right? But now you start looking at what is your customer journey, right? So how much pain would it cause your customer if you show up and say, hey, great, I have this, industry leading piece of equipment. I can sell it to you. We'll take great care of it. We'll make sure it has uptime. But this network stuff, good luck. So see you next time we talk, right? And then they're sitting there like, okay, now we have to interface with another person and bring them in, and do those people know the Philips equipment, et cetera, right?
It's the worst experience for a customer, right? When they say, hey, Philips, your system is slow. And we say, no, our system is working fine. There's a problem on your network. And they call Cisco or they call their internal, and everybody's pointing at each other.
Exactly.
It's curious, right? And so we decided, we're going to just help them solve the whole problem end to end. And if we have to be the middle person and work with Cisco or whoever it is, we'll take that role and do it because to your point, they can't get what they want unless that problem is fixed. And for us in this example, the network infrastructure is such an important component of it all. That's just absolutely fundamental to what we're doing there. So yeah,
absolutely. So by eliminating that friction for your customers and improving their experience, you're expanding your own value proposition and your revenue potential, right? Exactly. So it's just a really good example of looking. I think sometimes companies get, really, they're kind of stuck in their history, right? And so when they start thinking about innovating or servitizing or delivering outcomes, they have really good intentions of innovating, but they still kind of are on this lane, right? And so just being able to kind of expand the view a bit and just think about, okay, what are these friction points? What do we hear? What do we see? Where do we know our products connect with other systems in our customers' infrastructure, et cetera? Because sometimes it's a situation of not communicating enough with your customers to the point where you're not asking the right questions for them to share their pain points. But sometimes they might not know to ask you, right? So sometimes it's observing instead and going to them with suggestions, right? So that was just one thing that I thought was important to mention. And there was another one, but I forgot it now. So hopefully it'll come back to me. But I think that's just, those are fantastic examples of, really being able to look at your customers' journeys and look for those opportunities to really help them, and in turn, help yourself by creating more potential.
Yeah, I've got a mentor of mine who always says, Chris, we have two ears and one mouth, right? And you got to use them in those proportions. So you said it a few times, but it is really listening. And I think sometimes it's also, when you talk about that trusted advisor comment, sometimes it's about being brave enough to tell the customer, hey, I know you want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the best practice. We had a customer who wanted to use Active Directory in a certain way. No other Philips customer does what they do. And we should have said to them, look, you're taking a risk doing that, and we're not sure we can support that. But I think a lot of times our tendency is we want to close this deal, so let's just do what the customer wants. But I think one of the reasons why customers want to work with an industry leader is because of the experience you have as an industry leader, especially when
Absolutely.
implementing very complex things like this. They want to know what the best, most successful customers have done and how they've done it. So,
Yeah.
I think you got to kind of own that and bring it to the forefront.
And you just reminded me of my other point, so thank you. But it was exactly that, which is when you have, a wealth of assets that are connected assets across a variety of customers, and you can look for those insights that your customer base is going to find value in. That in and of itself is another opportunity for that revenue diversification, and to differentiate yourself, to build that relationship, right? To stop looking at it as a transactional product sale, break fix service, to that partnership, because there's so much value, in your case to the hospitals, of you knowing, based on fact, based on data, hey, actually the best practice other hospitals do is this. Let me show you a couple examples. A customer we have in this state does this state does this. They don't have that information. So that information, that data, is power you have that you can use to educate your customer base that no one else has, right? So a lot of times that data in and of itself is an untapped opportunity to expand these relationships and diversify revenue, because companies might use it operationally internally, but they're not looking at it from that perspective of, what's this telling us that is insights, best practices, information that our customers would potentially pay to know, or that we can bundle into this overall thing.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Again, one of the customers that have bought into this as a service model with us around our patient monitoring. I was at a quarterly review with them not long ago, and we were reviewing their statistics. And so the monitoring gets broken into three segments. There's high acuity, mid acuity, and low. So the most sick patients are in high acuity. Your sort of middle patients are in the mid, and then when you get like checked into the ER or the general ward, they put you on these low acuity monitors. And so by looking at their statistics over the last quarter, and we're reviewing this from a billing point of view, like, hey, here's your usage, this is what your quarterly invoice is going to be. But they saw this huge spike in mid acuity, and they start to ask operational questions about why. Why did it go up so much? I don't understand. Well, it was driven by COVID volume, but it's to your point that if you have this huge install base of information, not only can you help one hospital compare itself to the other and get to best practice, of course, the information is completely anonymized and de-identified and things like that. But also, even within the hospital, they're not always seeing operationally what's going on.
Right.
Everything from how the equipment is being used, and I gave some of those examples earlier, to where is the equipment. I mean, we have a patient-worn device that allows people to walk around the hospital when they're recovering while still being monitored. Well, things get lost all the time, and I can tell the last time it made a network connection where in the hospital it was. And so it even as simple as I lost my keys, help me find them, sort of thing.
Yeah,
So
sure.
It's all about data. And I know there's a question that we'll talk about maybe at the end about my vision of what's next, and it's all about how do we better use all this data that's being generated, whether it's to deliver an economic or a patient outcome. I think there are clinical outcomes that could potentially be better achieved if we could somehow, and Google, Apple, GE, Siemens, Philips, we're all trying to get there, but nobody's really cracked the code yet. But if you
Mm-hmm.
think about all the sick patients that go to a hospital, so much information about them and their symptoms and their treatments have been
Mm-hmm.
captured. That's a place where we've got to start applying AI and machine learning and things like that so that we can get to better treatment plans, quick
Yeah.
diagnosis, and things like that. That's sort of a vision of the future that I have.
Okay, we're gonna get there.
All right.
All right. So everything we've talked about is really exciting. You know, you guys are doing an amazing job of becoming that partner to your customers instead of a vendor or supplier, and really looking at modernizing the relationships you have with them. But you know, this process and that shift it's a fundamental change in how you're doing business, right? And that is in no way do I want to touch on the good points and have people think like, oh, you know,
Yeah.
Phillips is doing it, it must be easy, because it isn't. It's really, really hard. And I think that you know, the deeper and richer the history in developing, manufacturing, selling, servicing products, the harder this transformation can be, and this shift can be. So you're obviously doing an excellent job at it, but I want to talk about a couple of the major points, and you can maybe share a little bit the challenges and how you've either overcome them or are working to overcome them. And the first thing I want to talk about is just, you know, this idea of transitioning to the as a service model, right? So for Philips, you know, I understand the value to the customers loud and clear, but to you guys, you know, you're moving from these large influxes of revenue to, you know, more of a recurring model, and then you're risk sharing. So, you know, to your point, if, you know, the hospital doesn't use as much one month as another month, you know, that dips. So explain how you kind of get on the same page about why and how that's worth
Yeah.
the risk and what that takes to migrate to.
Well, there's a lot in that question. So
Mm-hmm.
let me try to touch on some of the topics there. You know, the first thing I would say is as you start to make a transformation like this, think about Philips. As I said, it was a 130-year-old company when I introduced myself. And for 125 of those years or so, we sold a thing. We manufactured a thing, sold it, and then did some service on it, right? So all of our processes, all of our back-end systems are designed to do that thing. And so, you know, a few years ago, we decided to get into this solution space, and all of a sudden, SAP doesn't want to allow us to transact business that way, or Salesforce.com. Salesforce is not, you know, a little bit more flexible, but you know, ServiceMax, for example, is really good
Mm-hmm.
at break fix service and dispatching engineers and doing things like that, but not so good with other things. So there's a lot about kind of tuning up your back office system to allow these business models to work and things like that. Then you start having, you know, discussions with your CFOs and folks because they used to get in this sort of, you know, episodic revenue is what I would call it.
Mm-hmm.
You install a huge capital deal, and there's a little bit of services that go along with that. But you know, that's how we forecast revenue. But we're basically getting all the revenue up front. So let's just say, you know, we're going to do $1 million deal. We get $1 million up front. We get a $75,000 a year service contract, and that's kind of your model. Now we've gone towards that $1 million gets spread over 5 years. And oh, by the way, there's some risk in it because if the customer doesn't achieve their outcomes, you know, you're going to make less money in that month. And we actually saw that, you know, a lot of our solutions, we have a pay-per-use solution for our picture archiving services. So when you get an image done on an MRI or a CT or whatever, it gets stored digitally, and you know, clinicians retrieve that and they work the images and they read them and all that stuff. Well, during COVID, a lot of elective procedures were postponed. So for the whole year last year, you know, people getting MRI scans are going in some cases for things as serious as like bypass surgery. A lot of that was postponed for a long time. So the usage of those images went down, and our revenue went down, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's a big hit. So why would you still do it? I think why you would still do it first and foremost is this is the direction that industry is going in. So if you don't make the shift, you're just going to become irrelevant in a few years. That's one reason. But I think the second more compelling reason is it deepens the partnership with your customer, and it makes what you do really, really sticky. So these customers that have been using your service as a service, it's not easy to switch.
Hmm.
it's really, really difficult to migrate that data that might be in our systems, the competitor systems, or what have you, once you kind of make that shift. But I think you become sort of indispensable as a partner, so the long term is worth it. The other thing I'd say is if you go from, you know, that episodic revenue, and all of my peers who are listening to this podcast will tell you, you've got these huge fourth quarter hockey sticks. You've got to make that Q4 number. Everything's being discounted. There's so much pressure to make that revenue number. That means somebody has to sell it, supply chain has to deliver, I have to go out and install it, and all that stuff needs to happen. But if it's recurring revenue, that recurring revenue just builds on itself and builds on itself and builds on itself and builds on itself. You still have to renew it, and hopefully
Hmm.
over the life cycle you're expanding it, but it's a lot more predictable, and it just makes running your quarterly business that much more sustainable, and it's a little bit easier, to be honest.
Yeah. It's just that initial transition. It's this big hurdle, and then you can start to see how it can be an improvement. I
Yeah,
think.
I'm jealous, so jealous of the companies who started this way, like Salesforce.com, because they didn't have to make this shift. And then there are companies like IBM who like said, we're not going to be in mainframes anymore. We're going to shift totally to services. And they kind of like made a bold decision. At Philips, we still do both.
Mhm.
So it's sometimes hard, to kind of run both models at
Straddle,
the same
yeah.
time. But there's good reason to do it, and I'll tell you the number one reason to do it is not every customer is ready to consume this way either. There are still quite a few big customers that just aren't interested.
Mhm.
They want to buy capital and depreciate over 10 years because that suits their operating model better. So for us, it works being in both worlds at the same time. Sometimes I wish it wasn't the case because I think we could move faster, but we're balancing it as well as we can.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a big one. The other one I'm wondering if we can just touch on quickly before we get to the other big one. And I say quickly because I know that service is your world, not necessarily sales overall. But
Yeah.
obviously, this is a complete shift for sales too, right? I mean, it's a different value proposition. It's expanding really the stakeholders within a customer organization that you need to be selling to. When you get into these adjacent services and all of that. So what have you seen in relation to what it takes to transition to selling the as a service model?
Yeah, a few things there. I think first of all, it's not a department level sale anymore. You can't go to the
Mhm.
head of biomed or the chief nurse of a unit or the chief radiologist. It's a C-suite sell. So that means the salespeople have to really up their game and learn how to talk to and sell to the C-suite because these tend to be longer term and they tend to be enterprise wide. They're big bets on both sides of the equation. Second of all, the incentive schemes have to be taken into an account. So we have a really good sales executive within Philips who came over from Microsoft. And at Microsoft, remember, you used to buy Windows in Office and pay $300 for it, and you got the CDs and you loaded it up.
Mm.
So Microsoft shifted from that model towards 360, which everything is online and downloadable. That had changed the comp plans for their people because of that. They
Mhm.
just weren't getting the one-time episodic hit anymore. And so now you need to comp on like total contract value over time and things like that, and that's very different. And I think the last piece is, and I alluded to this a little bit in my last answer, but the renewal becomes a really important conversation, and expansion becomes a really important conversation. So out in industry, you'll hear people talk about success managers, customer success managers. We're
Mhm.
still figuring out what that means for us in Philips, but part of it is making sure that when the renewal conversation comes up, that customer is so happy with the value that you've added that it's not even a conversation. But it's also things like, hey, you're doing really well in these units of your hospital with the solution. Why don't we go to the West building now? Or why don't we go to your children's clinic or whatever it is? And so, it should provide you for the base to do that stuff. So if you're doing it well, you're not hunting business as much
Right.
as harvesting business, but it's a different art form or different science, or however my sales colleagues would describe it. It's just a different
Sure.
methodology. So those are some of the thoughts around sales. I can't emphasize that first point enough. Up in your game to be able to talk to the C-suite.
Mhm.
At Philips, we've sort of developed playbooks around how to do that. We have account executives who are identified as those people we should go in and have that conversation.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, we're on our journey. I can't say we've solved it all yet, but we've had some success there. And even identifying the right customers. So in the U.S., there's a lot of consolidation going on around healthcare. Instead of lots of small hospitals, now you have these big integrated delivery networks,
Hmm.
and some of them are kind of taking this journey and making this leap of faith with us. But like I said earlier, some of them just aren't ready yet, and they'll be ready on their own time. So I think
Hmm.
segmentation is really important as well.
Yeah, I would imagine it forces a closer relationship between service and sales too, right?
Absolutely.
Because it's just kind of a continuous cycle of, that, like you said, you don't want to get to a point where they're sold, they're serviced, and then they need to be
Right.
sold again, right?
Well,
Like you
and
want
that's
it to
the
just be cohesive.
yeah, and that's the way it used to be. So my sales counterpart, hey, I sold the equipment, and he gets all that order intake and all that revenue,
Mhm.
and I get the service. And so in a way, we kind of had our own P&Ls, and we can manage them
Yeah.
separately. There's a dependency, of course. Now it's just one thing. The
Hmm.
solution is the equipment and services integrated as one thing. So we can't split it up anymore. We have to be side by side, and it forces that, and that's actually a really good thing.
Yeah. And that's probably a whole nother podcast on its
Yeah.
own, right? Because I think, the companies that are trying to do this with two P&Ls, or the companies that are trying to innovate this way without the top level commitment to taking the business in that direction. I mean, it's really tough to make this transition if everybody isn't working in the same, in the same vein. But we'll tackle that another time. I want to get into one more big thing before we finish for today, which is, you know, the thing we've alluded to but haven't really discussed in detail yet is the fact that, this requires a real significant shift in skill set, mindset of your technicians. And so you touched on the fact that, you enabled that, you gave them a choice, empowered them to decide, do they want to kind of expand their skill set, and all of that. But I know you've also increased your use of contingent workers to be able to eliminate some of the, we'll say, more traditional break fix, non-value add work, so that your technicians, you can focus on upskilling them, reskilling them, expanding their skills to have those consultative relationships and to do these different things. So talk a little bit about that, and how, what you've learned in making that work for Philips.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good topic. I mean, at the end of the day, you can only focus on so much. So you define what your core competencies are. And our core competencies have shifted from people who are really good mechanically and electrically to people more IT oriented, as I've said, or people more consultative, which I think is even more kind of a unique skill. So what we've determined over time is that that's where we wanted to focus and develop folks. But guess what? At some point when we ship product, there's a loading dock where there's tons of boxes of our stuff. And so, we used to pay our staff, whatever their hourly rates are, to unbox things and to stage things and to prep them so that they can go into the hospital. So, that's a really easy example of where we've used third parties to kind of supplement. It's not a skill that's highly specialized. It's not something that we want to develop a core competency in. And, there's some variability around demand. So, if we have a really big fourth quarter, I don't want to hire 100 people and have them part of my fixed costs as we enter the next fiscal year. I want to be able to ramp them up and down as
Mm-hmm.
needed. So it's really helped there. But even if I say, okay, that's some basic stuff, I'll take one step further. We do a lot of staging of like servers and equipment like that, and that's pretty standard and can even be done remotely. So there, even in the IT space, when it's something fairly basic like loading an image onto a server or doing some configuration of a server, we've started to work with third parties as well. Um, if I have a third party that shows up on site, they're part of the Philips team. They get
Mm-hmm.
treated as if they were a Philips employee. They get the same training in many cases that our employees would get. We really do a lot to ensure the quality is there. It's a little bit more difficult to control, if I'm honest with you. I mean, probably the worst story I can tell you is, one of our third party guys like fell asleep on a patient bed or stole a dessert off the lunch tray. I mean, these things kind of happen from time to time. So you do
Yeah.
need a process to check in and make sure that the quality is there. But for us, I think the main benefit is being able to focus on what's core and it offsets some costs. Of course, that's part of the reason why we do it, and it allows for a lot more flexibility.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky road to go down, but I think it's important. Like I said, the approach we've taken is we're allowing and promoting the development opportunities for our internal folks. So as we shift, we want them to come with us.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, where it doesn't make sense for us to unbox equipment and to configure, do basic configurations, we're just going to use the contingent help. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's happening everywhere. And it's kind of interesting. People talk a lot about the gig economy, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if a guy who works for Philips can change his field service engineer jacket and go in and work for Siemens, and on the next call go in and work for G. I don't know if we'll get there in healthcare because we're a little bit specialized.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely, I see it as an increasing trend that any activity that's not core, you're working with a partner, and they are partners, and you're giving them the training and you enable them to work on your behalf.
Yeah, and I think what you said at the beginning is spot on. You can't do everything, right? So if you're going to work toward this world of creating more value, then you need to focus on fueling the skills to do that value added stuff instead of unboxing things, right? I mean, it's you're not going to want to pay um you know uh W-2 employees to do all of those things, and this gives you that opportunity to unburden them with some of the things that you can leverage these other resources for, so that they have the time, bandwidth, energy, to commit to where you're going and build their skills, right? So I think it's a really good point. I actually think that's another area we could do a podcast on,
Mhm.
because I agree it's a direction we're going in, but at least based on my conversations, I still have more people asking me, so what do you hear around contingent workers, and how do you make sure they don't fall asleep on site, and how do you train them, and how do you control them, all of those things. So I think it's an area that will grow, but there's a lot of people trying to sort out
Right.
how to make it work. And I think that's a whole nother conversation. But the premise of incorporating that into your labor mix to free up your resources, to progress and build skills in the direction of those solutions, I think is very, very smart.
Hmm.
So we'll have to hopefully have you back sometime. Okay, so last question, Chris, and you touched on this earlier. The future is data,
Yeah.
right? That's where we're going, right? So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, my vision of the future starts with, Philips being an indispensable partner helping hospitals achieve these outcomes that we've been talking about. So we'll become trusted advisors, and we're bringing to bear all the experience and everything that we've learned by being a leader in healthcare, and pretty much present in every hospital and every health system in the world, but especially in North America. And so I think about it this way: in certain segments, we have like 50+ % market share. And
Mm-hmm.
that means for patients being treated with those devices, 1 out of every 2, we're collecting their data. And it's all being saved now, right? Everything's being saved. It all gets dumped into data warehouses and all of that. So I think, like we were talking earlier, being able to harvest that data, I think it starts out with simple things like dashboards. Like I want to watch the patient flow through the hospital. I want to
Mm-hmm.
have a sort of command center where I can see everything happening. And we have that in some senses. Like there are central organizations where they can monitor all the cardiac monitoring of the hospital like in one place, and there are people behind all these LCD, and it's kind of like a knock but for healthcare. I think it
Mm-hmm.
starts with things simple like that, but then it gets into more advanced, like how can we really harvest this information and use it to drive a better outcome? Is it machine learning and AI? I'm actually not smart enough to tell you whether that stuff works because there's a lot of hype about it, but there aren't really good examples. But I certainly think that you can say if a patient came in and he had these symptoms and he
Mm-hmm.
was a man and 50 years old, and whatever else his demographic information was, if you've seen 1,000 of those
Right.
cases, how were they treated and which one had the best outcome? In
Mm-hmm.
my simple mind, those are ways that you can really provide a valuable service that not only helps our customers, but helps mankind, right? It helps us stay in the hospital less, get diagnosed
Mhm.
more precisely, and get back to our healthy lives. Philips actually has a big play right now for monitoring people at home. So when you're chronically ill, you don't want to be in the hospital. Doctors don't want you in the hospital. So let's figure out better ways to deliver telehealth. That's a big play for us, and I think data enables that, and enables better outcomes there as well. So, if I were in school right now, I'd be becoming a data scientist because I think that's where it's at. And for companies like Philips, I think it's yet another area where we can develop services and solutions, and continue on this journey that we've started.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have two sons, and my 5-year-old son has type 1 diabetes. So I've never cared so much about, medical data as I do now. But I mean, he has a continuous glucose monitor and he has an insulin pump. And, those two things don't yet, at least the type he has, work together. Right. But the advancements that you're seeing
Yeah.
in, being able to leverage that data to, if not find a cure, which hopefully is coming, be able to have they call it the artificial pancreas, right? So
Yeah.
it's just,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
really cool.
And COVID, I
Yeah.
think, last year forced a lot of that. There's a healthcare provider out in the Midwest somewhere, huge system. And I think they were doing like 4,000 telehealth visits a month before COVID.
Mm-hmm.
This is like 80,000 telehealth visits a month. And, it's something that nobody wanted before the pandemic. Now, docs like it better,
Mm-hmm.
patients like it better. I mean, they don't have to leave their house and travel. And, if it's not that serious of an issue, I mean, I myself, I think it's great. I'd rather call my doctor on the phone and say, I think I have a rash, and answer a couple of questions and get a prescription than,
Right.
interrupt my day and go into the hospital where other sick people, or the doctor's office where there are other sick people. So I think it's inevitable. And, technology will certainly enable it. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just now even a bigger pool of data to pull from. So yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of what we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years.
Cool. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming and sharing. I love the vision. What Philips has accomplished is fantastic, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. I think it'll be really helpful for our audience, and I'd love to have you back sometime.
Sarah, thanks so much. It was really fun to talk about all this stuff with you. And yeah, I'd love to come back anytime.
Awesome. You can check out more of our content by visiting us at futureoffieldservice.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn as well as Twitter at the Future of FS. The Future of Field Service podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more at ifs.com. As always, thank you for listening.